Welcome to this revision video on James II. I'm going to discuss in this short lesson James's aims and objectives. Not a topic you would get an essay on, but something you would need to know about perhaps as part of an essay on James II, his policies, the causes of the Great Revolution, or indeed it could form the focus of a source question or interpretation question. So let's dive in. What are we going to be using? We'll look in this lesson at James's own words, what he himself said, and we'll look at some of the historiographical debate on this subject because historians disagree on what James was aiming to do in his short reign. And in particular, there's a divide between what are called Whig historians and revisionist historians. There's a third group, but I mentioned them at the end, but this is the sort of basic distinction. So let's go straight into looking at what James himself said. Now, there are several things that James said during his reign which shed some light on what he was trying to achieve. And possibly the most famous and most important is the famous Privy Council speech. Hours after he became king, very shortly after his accession, James summoned his Privy Council and he made a speech to them. And in that short speech, he reassured the Privy Council that he was not going to be a revolutionary figure, that he was not going to make great changes. Now, obviously, he was speaking in a context where he understood that many people feared his accession, that he was distrusted as a Catholic and as he had been a bit of a hate figure in England really since the exclusion crisis at the end of the 1670s. And so this Privy Council speech was really famous because in it he did quite a bit to set people's nerves at ease. He promised in particular that he would, quote, preserve the government of church and state as it is by now established. Now, what does that mean? By preserving the government of the church, what he's saying is that he would not make any changes to the way in which the Church of England was governed. That means that he would maintain the Church of England as it currently existed. Changing the government would mean replacing the head of the church, i.e. bringing in the Pope, etc. And James, in this quote, he's making it very clear that he is not going to Romanize or Catholicize the Church of England. He's going to leave it as it is by law established. And the law says the Church of England is Protestant, it's ruled by Anglican bishops, and the king is the head. Preserving the state as by law established means that he's not going to turn England into an absolute monarchy. He's going to, if you like, maintain the constitution as it existed under Charles, i.e. England is going to remain a parliamentary monarchy or a limited monarchy. So James is really saying here that he is not going to create a Catholic absolute monarchy in England. He goes a little bit further, and in the same speech he actually promised to defend and support the Church of England because he said he knew it was a monarchist organisation. Now, it certainly was. The Church of England was a strong supporter of monarchy. But James in this speech is making it very clear that he will defend the Church, support the Church, and maintain the Constitution. However, he also in that speech talks about respecting the law. He says the laws of England make the king strong, and he understands that and is going to respect the law. We do have some private comments from James, so the French ambassador, Monsieur Barillon, and in those private comments, James takes a slightly different line from the line he took with the Privy Council. He made it very clear to the French ambassador that he intended to use his short reign to promote and defend Catholicism. Now, that is slightly contradictory to what he said with Barillon, and I think that maybe shows us more accurately his aim as he understood it. He saw his mission on earth as restoring the fortunes of the Catholic Church in England. Quite what he meant by that we can discuss in a moment, but I think we have to take the Privy Council speech with a pinch of salt. James understood he was speaking to the public. The Privy Council speech was in fact published, it was printed, and so James, that Privy Council speech is as much propaganda as it is an insight into what James actually thought and what he actually intended to do. We have to measure the Privy Council speech against his private remarks to men like Barillon, where he revealed his more genuine objectives. Now, this is why historians disagree. Revisionist historians have argued, and most famously, by the way, John Miller, have argued that when James confided to Barillon that he wanted to promote Catholicism, all he meant by that, say historians like John Miller, was simply to bring in toleration. That they interpret those remarks of James as simply indicating his desire to give freedom to Roman Catholics. The freedom for Roman Catholics to worship in public and the freedom for Roman Catholics to participate in politics. So, in other words, James wants to get rid of the penal laws and the Test Acts. Um, and historians like Miller admit that sometimes James stretched his powers. He may have acted in ways that appeared illegal or perhaps even absolutist. But, Miller says, James himself wasn't absolutist. He never intended to become an absolute monarchy, and he never intended to forcibly convert the nation to the Catholic Church. All he was trying to do was defend the interests and promote the interests of the Catholic Church by granting them toleration. Now, other historians have argued that that is incorrect. In particular, older historians writing in the late 19th century and the 20th century, have alleged that James intended to go much further. G.M. Trevelyan argued that James aimed for the evolution of the church and state towards the Roman model. In other words, Trevelyan argued that James was in fact trying to turn England into a Catholic absolute monarchy. Now that doesn't mean converting the entire English population, but it means creating a Catholic government in England, a Catholic absolute government. England become a country with a Catholic king and a Catholic ruling class. That, says Trevelyan, is what James was aiming for, and if he had remained on the throne longer, that's what he might have achieved. So Winston Churchill, in his famous History of the English-Speaking People, agreed. He wrote of James II, he was a bigot. Toleration was the natural first step to the revival of Catholicism. In other words, he agrees with Miller and says, yes, James was aiming at toleration, but that was only the first step. He intended to go much further. And he agrees with Trevelyan that James was aiming for absolute monarchy, Catholic absolutism in England. Churchill actually goes further. Churchill believes that James did intend to force the English people to convert. He wrote that James's aim was to offer Englishmen one choice, the Mass or death. In other words, they'd be forced on pain of death to convert to Catholicism. I see no evidence of that. I think Churchill sometimes exaggerates, and this is a classic case. But I think we have to take seriously the argument that both men make, that James was aiming for absolute monarchy. Now, you might say, well, this is a rather old-fashioned view, and John Miller's a much more recent historian, and presumably he's looked at the evidence afresh and has come to a more reliable conclusion. Well, we have some modern historians who side with the Whigs, in particular William Speck and Steve Pincus. These are two historians writing today who disagree with John Miller and who argue that, in fact, the Whigs are closer to the truth than the revisionists were. Both men argue very strongly that James James was aiming at strengthening the English monarchy, that he was aiming for a more authoritarian kind of monarchy. Let's even use the word absolute. Pincus uses the phrase Catholic modernity, that James was trying to modernize England and to bring it into line with the kind of Catholic absolute monarchies that existed in Europe at the time. So what do I believe? Well, I think I agree with Pincus and Speck. I think James was aiming at the promotion of Catholicism. And I think that what he meant by that was the creation of a Catholic ruling class in England. I think he wanted to remove all the penalties from Catholicism, and and create incentives for the elite, the gentry, and the nobility to convert. I don't think they would have been forced. I don't think it was ever James's intention to force people with violence to convert. But I think he planned to do it by creating incentives. I think he planned to create a powerful Catholic monarchy in England, a monarchy that was not restrained by parliaments. The way in which he intended to do this changes during his reign. It's clear at the beginning of the reign that his plan was to work with the Tories in order to achieve this. He had a Tory parliament and he believed that they would cooperate with him to repeal the anti-Catholic laws. When that failed and he had to dissolve his first parliament, then James's aims and objectives changed slightly, and he planned to create a kind of a Catholic dissenter parliamentary alliance by packing a parliament in 1688. Now, I think this was a pipe dream. I don't think such an alliance could have existed, but I think it was James's aim to try to create one. So, James was, I think, ultimately planning for long-term revolutionary changes in England. By the and of course, a fundamental part of that plan was to give birth to an heir, something which he was working on steadily from 1685 and finally succeeded. So I think Pincus is correct. I think Speck is correct. I think the Whigs are onto something. I think Miller is slightly misguided. James was not just aiming at granting freedom to Catholics, and I don't believe that the Privy Council speech is a genuine statement of his aims and objectives. I believe he intended to go much further. I hope you found this helpful. You'll find some material on this in my notes, and if you want to read uh, Steve Pincus, even the introduction of his textbook, you'll find a copy in the library, and I can also provide you with a copy as well. Best of luck.